Joshua Blakeney. I'm a journalist, freelance journalist based here in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Today is November 20th. It's about 3 a.m. here for me. But I'm pleased to be joined by Ryan Dawson, who's a YouTube maestro, who's an activist, an internet blogger. He's well known by many who follow geopolitical matters. And he's in Kansai region of Japan, a part of the world I know quite well. Having studied Japanese at university and traveled throughout Japan when I was 19 years old. So it's great to have you with us from Japan, Ryan, and I'm very much looking forward to conversing with you today on the important subject of what's going on in Israel, Palestine. The people of Gaza are being besieged by the Zionist regime in an indiscriminate, brutal and murderous, barbaric assault on the largely defenseless third world population of Gaza. I'd like to know what you think about that and how we can de-talk and demystify the propaganda that's emanating from the Israeli-influenced media in the West. I was observant of the fact that, the BBC was making reference to Israelis being killed. 3 Israelis were killed, whereas X amount of Palestinians merely died. Just these subtle words, they certainly have an impact on the public psyche. And so I'm just wondering how you're viewing this. What's your take on the unfolding events in Gaza that's going on right now in the latter weeks of the year of 2012?
Well, a point on the language issue you made, we do need to take our words back, but we're still a step above where we were before Cass led, where they referred to all the rockets as missiles rather than rockets, implying that they had guidance systems or were propelled. These rockets are fired from the ground, that's it. They don't have their own propulsion systems. These are homemade rockets, like Katyushas and things. So at least they're admitting they're rockets now rather than acting like they're getting bombarded with missiles. And they always toe the line that, Israel's just facing rockets every day when there hasn't been any rockets fired all year, and we're almost at the very end of the year, until after they murdered the 13-year-old boy and murdered 2 children and shot up a funeral of those children. They shot up a tent full of people. And so, yeah, as you say, and it's more than 20 dead now, a lot more than 20 murdered now. But my take on it is that part of it's the election. But I think this has been planned for a long time. It was right after the U.S. elections, too, which is important, I think, in the timing. Netanyahu has had these plans. It's not the first time they've invaded Gaza, not the first time they've butchered civilians. And we also have to remember that in the middle of all of this, there's also an illegal military occupation in the West Bank in Palestine with complete ethnic colonization, where they bulldoze down homes and build new homes for the self-proclaimed chosen race of God. And so what I see is they tried this before, back in 2006. Before they invaded Lebanon, they beta tested everything on Gaza. They gave the kidnapped soldiers rationale, which is, again, playing around with words. You don't kidnap a soldier. You capture soldiers. The fact that soldiers were even there should have been a problem to begin with. If you had foreign soldiers in any other country, what do you think the reaction would be? So they tested that. They did the same garbage to invade Lebanon. They said the whole thing rested on kidnapped soldiers, just like they said with Gaza. And they went into Lebanon, but in 2005, they set the entire thing up because they had the Syrian troops moved out of Lebanon first. They had the Rafik Hariri assassination. It was blamed on the Syrians. It was later proven that the Syrians didn't do it, but the UN had already forced them to move their troops out of Lebanon. The fallback position was they blamed it on a Palestinian. This is sort of like the USS Liberty, where they said it was an Egyptian boat, and then first they said Egypt did it, and they said, okay, we did it, but we thought it was an Egyptian boat. And we all know they attacked an American ship, and there was collusion there. Well, here they blamed it on the Syrians, later fell back on a Palestinian. They blamed it on a guy who had been missing for 2 weeks and tortured and confessed, and then the investigation went in and the UN cleared that too. But it didn't matter. It was too late. Syrian troops had been removed, and they already had the military in Lebanon wasn't going to lift a finger and didn't lift a finger. So they thought they had a one-on-one match with Hezbollah, which they did, and they still lost because Hezbollah fought them off. Israel's not very good at fighting people who can do a little bit more than throw rocks or fire homemade rockets. What we have here is the same kind of situation. Syria's hands are full again because of these FSA terrorists and Al-Qaeda groups that they've linked that are invading Syria, these foreign-backed mercenaries from Turkey and Qatar. And they believe they can crush Gaza and then turn on into Lebanon.
So is it a greater Israel that we're looking at? I mean, obviously, there is a theory that Israel is doing what Professor Francis Boyle, an international jurist who I admire greatly, has called a slow motion genocide. He's drawn attention to the reality that, the plot on the Israeli hard right is to expand the Israeli nation state from the Nile to the Euphrates, which would require the ethnic cleansing of what's left of the Palestinian people in that region. And so is it a case of killing 1,000 here, 12 people there, 20 people there, until all the Palestinians either flee for their lives or are completely wiped out and exterminated by this ethnic nationalist settler state that's, that's the bane of the Middle East and increasingly of the world? Because, of course, none of this could take place without the support of Western governments. Canada's Prime Minister Stephen Harper was straight out making a statement that Israel has a right to defend itself. Considering Israel broke the ceasefire, surely it's the Palestinians who should have the right to defend themselves, because they're the ones who have been attacked and who have had their ceasefire and tranquility in the region breached by the Israeli state.
Obama as well came out with a statement saying any nation would defend itself from missiles. He used the word missiles being shot at it. How can Obama say that while he is bombing Pakistan and Yemen with drones? And has been since his first day in office, or his third day in office. He started his first day after he got elected again. He's been bombing Pakistan and Yemen, so they're getting hit with missiles and bombs, but they're not defending themselves. We're defending ourselves against terrorism by using terrorist tactics, because these drones just kill civilians outright. They never give you names. They never give you names of the victims because they have no idea who they've just butchered. They're creating terrorism with their own acts of terrorism. And so, of course, Canada and the U.S. are probably the most Zionist states outside of Israel. It's pathetic. I'd give it to Canada in their race, but at least they have some kind of something they're getting out of it. The less oil the U.S. buys from the Middle East, the more they buy from Canada. The U.S. gets nothing out of it whatsoever. They get nothing but more demands. It's just our Congress is openly bribed by unregistered foreign lobbies like AIPAC from Israel.
Yes, and it's clear to me there's a kind of a Zionist exceptionalism that's prevalent in the political discourse in North America. It's quite clear to me that there's the idea of applying universal human rights criteria to the Israel-Palestine conflict, the idea of applying a universal free speech principles to talking about Zionism, that's not allowed, that's prohibited. That there's a kind of exceptionalism where there's one rule for the whole of humanity and a different rule for God's chosen people. I've been intrigued by the scholarship of Gilad Atzmon, the ex-Israeli, who defected from Israel and now lives in London, who's done work on Jewish identity politics. And when I think about this idea of the election forthcoming in Israel, the idea that to appeal to the electorate, the competing political parties vie for how much Palestinian blood they can shed, how much how many Palestinians they can take out, and that will win them votes. That really says something about the kind of mindset that exists in this settler colony.
That was what happened to the entire debate system with the Republicans and Democrats. They went on and on about how pro-Israel they were, how it was the shining democracy and had a right to defend itself and stuff. But it's not just the Israelis who are put on a pedestal. The U.S. does this. They neglect not just Palestinians, but whether it's in Bahrain or Uzbekistan or Liberia. Like while Charles Taylor had a cut hand unit, was burning houses and killing all these Africans, they talked nonstop about Saddam. That's all they wanted to talk about. In Bahrain, there's butchering, of course. That's not mentioned. But if something happens in Yemen or something happens in Syria, they'll blame the government there, even though there's suicide bombings and all manner. The U.S. supports MEK in Iraq and Iran, blowing up scientists and cars, and they support Jandala and Baluchistan, East Pakistan, total terrorist group. So whenever it's our terrorists, and of course we supported Al-Qaeda and the Taliban until they banned opium, and then that was a no-no, and we had a 180 there, but that's complicated. We sort of have our own privateer cells, in which I call it a rent-a-terrorist system. We used them in Chechnya. Some of the terrorists from 9/11 even were involved in the USS Cole bombing. We had used fighting Soviets in other wars and in North Africa as well. So it's hard to tell who's what. And then we support Al-Qaeda in Libya, and we're supporting Salafi jihadists in Syria. So it doesn't matter if someone's a terrorist. That what makes them a terrorist isn't that they kill kids or they have suicide bombings or butcher civilians or any of the terrorist tactics, terrorism using fear to control populations. That's not what makes you a terrorist. What makes you a terrorist is doing anything that goes against U.S. interest. Because you can completely be terrorist and commit terrorist acts or state-sponsored terrorism as in Israel or Bahrain or formerly in Egypt. None of that will matter. All that matters is this exceptionalism of America, right or wrong, no matter what. And the same thing with Israel. This sort of Zionist exceptionalism, like, well, Israel can never do anything wrong, is very akin to the Bush-Cheney rhetoric of we got attacked because of our freedoms. They cannot have the common sense and rationale to say maybe people hate us because we murder their families. Maybe people hate us because we bombed them. I mean, how would we react if that was us? And Ron Paul brought that up in a debate, the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, and they booed him. So there's something psychopathic culturally to say these people are good and these people are evil, this G.I. Joe mentality. It's very childish. And they can't see it. Israel has F-15s and modern weaponry, and they are just blowing the hell out of Palestine again. Just like they wiped out Jenin, like the settlements, the blockade, starving people, shooting people. It's outright murder and theft, and they get away with it because it's with American interests. Not for the people, but for the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, the Gaza ghetto is only 40 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide. And so that's filled with a population the size of the city I'm in. I'm in Canada's third largest metropolitan area. And yet Gaza has more people in a polity that's just 40 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide. Now, terrorism is targeting civilians to achieve political ends, political goals. Now, Israel calls the resistance in Gaza terrorists and says that they're merely targeting the terrorists and not the civilians. But when you're dropping bombs on such a densely populated area of, that's so small with so
not only bombs, they've dropped MK-77 and white phosphorus chemical weapons, which are illegal outright on Palestine.
Yes, so how, it's not like they have a weapon that says, oh, there's a Hamas or there's an Al-Qaeda, oh, boom, 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 there's another Hamas. Obviously these people are in civilian areas. Moreover, they bombed the media stations, Russia Today and Press TV, citing a concern with an antenna that's on the roof of there, which they said was a Hamas antenna. So this, Hamas, it sort of is like Bin Laden, or it's this kind of bogeyman phenomenon that we've seen since the false flag, since 9/11, the 9/11 false flag attack, which does have Israeli fingerprints, as you've so marvelously adumbrated for us. That the Israeli government was really at the origins of this war on terror, this war on Islam. The predicaments that the Israeli government are confronted with were globalized with 9/11. That we were all trained to view the world through Israel's spectacles, to perceive a threat from Islamic terrorism when one doesn't actually exist in Western states.
I mean, it's really clear. And if you can't see it today with what's going on in Syria, how the Turks and the Israelis and the Americans and Saudi Arabians work together, just look at Syria. We have a collusion of all these different countries financing, funding, and arming terrorists to terrorize a country.
Yes. And so what's going on with our media? Has it been infiltrated by agents of a foreign state, for example? I mean, when I was doing my graduate studies at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada, studying the events of 9/11, I had a Mossad agent start calling up the dean of the graduate school and asking him what's going on. How dare they fund someone to study conspiracy theories? So could it be that our media have been, in anticipation of this Israelocentric agenda that was initiated with the 9/11 false flag? Could it be that our media has been either bought up or infested with agents of the Zionist entity?
There's some of that, like Wolf Blitzer, former AIPAC employer, head anchor on CNN, but it's more so the Pentagon has been infiltrated by Zionist agents, and the Pentagon straight up owns the state-run media. You look at all the parent companies, and their board of directors have overlapping membership with the biggest aerospace companies, which gets the largest defense contracts every single year, Lockheed and Boeing and so forth. Every parent company, I've made a map of this. People are welcome to go see it, MIC I'll send you the link and we'll edit it in. I put it that way. Here's what the name of it. I forget what it is.
Yeah.
It has a map of it, and you can look at it. Okay, ABC is owned by Disney, and they have John Bryson and Biggs and these people, and they're all in the same BOD as Lockheed. And the Pentagon sort of acts as a giant umbrella corporation, and the Pentagon divvy out all this money from government, which is borrowed from the Fed or borrowed from some other central bank. They don't really have the money, but they just put the population in debt, stealing your money, and pay all these select industries which have an open revolving door policy with government. So the officials within the Pentagon, I don't even call it the Pentagon, let's call it the War Department. That's what it really is. The people in the War Department go and work for the same companies they allocate money to. And Congress repeatedly just gives them a blank check. 51% of our discretionary taxes in the U.S. just for the DOD, the War Department. And that doesn't include the State Department and the CIA and all the other intelligence agencies or terrorist organizations that we also have to pay for, or even things like our nuclear weapons. That's through the Department of Energy, so that doesn't even get included on the bill. We're paying unreal amounts of money, $1 trillion a year, to finance warfare. And they pay for the press. They learned that from Vietnam, because there was negative press in Vietnam. Every time someone died, it was on the news. You saw their name. You saw the people died. You were reminded that there's a war going on, wasting your money. And we had the combination of the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement together there, fighting against that. This was all pre-internet as well. Now we have the internet, but we've lost television completely. They made sure the next one to control all the propaganda.
So it's not surprising that we see Russia Today and Press TV's offices being bombarded by Israeli planes, because clearly people now do have recourse. They have the ability to turn to alternative media sources where they can see critical journalism of U.S. foreign policy, of Israeli foreign policy and domestic policy. Of course, the Vietnam War, people relied on the media towards the end being slightly honest to some extent. But I mean, when one imagines going back to the pre-internet days where there was, we were just beholden to the, the mainstream media that's bought and owned by the well-heeled in society who profit from wars invariably.
Look at the difference between the first Gulf War and the second. The first Gulf War was sort of pre-internet. It was 91, and there's no Windows 95, for example. And that was just completely bought by the public. Everybody had a yellow ribbon. They thought, we gotta go get Saddam. They invaded Kuwait, da-da-da. And that was based on lies, too, the whole babies on incubators mythology and things. But it had absolute support from the public. Very few. There weren't any giant anti-war protests, much less worldwide protests against the first invasion, which was also based on lies. By the second invasion of Iraq by the United States, there were worldwide protests, and that's because the monopolization of the media was no longer total. They could put things on the web, and this is still before YouTube and before Facebook, before MySpace, but it still got around enough through regular websites and blogs that people learned the truth. And now we have a lot more alternative media. I just call that real media. However, there are still an overwhelming majority of couch potatoes that, even though this is available on the web, they are just used to turning on the TV and listening to the lies. And it's very hard to get through that because we talk in circles sometimes. We talk to a very educated audience. We talk to people who are looking for things that make sense and looking and try. You can debunk it. See, the great thing about the internet is even playing field. You can have back and forth. You can talk, and yet on TV, it's all one way. They preach at you, and you have no means of asking them anything or saying anything back. Here's your story. They make it uniform. They repeat the same garbage on every channel. Is the message for its multipliers. And by this repetition, the same catchphrases and everything, you hear people saying their phrases. Oh, too big to fail. Well, we had to do something. Oh, it could have been a mushroom cloud. Blah, blah, blah. Pick your phrase from grassy knoll to weapons of mass destruction. They'll put one in there for you. And it's mind control. Not in the sense of like, I'm controlling your mind magically, but just it's brainwashing, it's propaganda, it's lies. And they watch it and they go, well, it's on TV, which has an authoritative source because the person's wearing a tie and they have flashy graphics and stuff. So, wouldn't they get in trouble if they lied? Actually, no. There is no law or rule telling you the mass media has to tell you the truth.
Yeah,
They mess up on basic geography. They mess up on everything. They always lie, but people still tune in.
And of course, there's a science of propaganda going back to Edward Bernays, who was Sigmund Freud's nephew, right? And he coined the phrase public relations when the Nazis made the word propaganda look bad. I guess until the Nazis came along, the word propaganda was used euphemistically in a way that we use public relations today. And, Edward Bernays, the founding father of modern public relations, he went from selling cigarettes to women. He did a photo op at the America Day Parade or something in New York, where he persuaded women that smoking cigarettes were torches of freedom in order to allow cigarette companies to cash in on the market. And instantly he was snapped up by the CIA, and he was commissioned to sell the regime change in Guatemala of ousting the Arbenz regime.
Eddie Bernays is why people eat bacon in the morning. It was never considered a breakfast food. He made it a breakfast food just to prove the point that he could. You can eat it whenever you want, but I'm just saying that's what happened.
Yes, and when I was doing my research on fluoride, I guess Bernays was also commissioned to sell fluoride to the American people. It's good for your teeth. That message was disseminated under his auspices, and so it's clear that there's a science of propaganda. That war is 90% psychological. Like you think of 9/11. I mean, what really was 9/11 in its essence? It was a psychological operation. You think at some level, some smart psychologist or something sat down and said, well, if we bring down those big, titans of those symbols of the U.S. Prosperity and economy, if we bring down the Twin Towers, that will have such a psychological impact on the American people that we can persuade them to go along with things which are clearly against the interests of ordinary Americans. I mean, this is one of the realities. It's because America is to some extent a democracy, and indeed Israel is to some extent a democracy, that these outrageous lies have to be propagated. I go back to, Gilad Atzmon. I really like his work. And someone said to him, oh, Gilad, you've compared Israel to the Nazis. And he said, well, in a way, Israel's worse than the Nazis because since, after the Enabling Act of 1933 and the Reichstag fire, the German state was not a democracy. It was a dictatorship. So the German people could never vote out Adolf Hitler. In the case of Israel, for example, right now they're bombarding Gaza partially in order to win votes and say, vote for me, I'll protect you from the Mephistopheles of terrorism that's going to that's going to plague the Israelis unless you vote for Netanyahu for another term or vote for the Kadima party, and they'll make sure that the terrorism is extirpated from Gaza, And likewise, when we think about 9/11, it's quite obvious to me that was a psychological operation because there is this kind of underpinning notion that leaders ought to be accountable to their people, even if it's a myth. That's one of the guiding philosophies, and so they have to do these outrageous...
It replaced the Cold War, too. It replaced the Cold War for the justification of this massive amount of spending on warfare. And they had gotten away with it in 93. I mean, the FBI completely botched an operation in 1993 to blow up a truck under the World Trade Center. It was parked in the wrong place. Again, Josie Hadass, the Mossad, they have fingerprints in there, collusion of the U.S. and Israel factions working together. They blamed that one on the Muslim Brotherhood, and everybody of importance ended up getting away. Just like with the USS Cole bombing, they all went to jail and they all got out of a miraculous prison break or one reason or another. Everybody escaped once again. But I mean, the FBI botched that operation. They said, I know you know the story, but I'm telling everyone else, they had to supposedly a sting operation to bust this terrorist cell that they had double agents inside of. COINTELPRO sitting there saying, okay, and the guys they had on the inside were coming back to the FBI and saying, look, they're going to attack and they're going to do it here, and this is what they want to use with this truck bomb. And the FBI supplied them with real weapons, real powder and real bombs. It was supposed to be fake so that it'd be harmless. They'd show up and they'd get arrested. Well, they showed up and they had the real stuff that the FBI had given them, but nobody showed up to stop them and there was no sting, and they blew the truck up. Fortunately, it was parked in the wrong place and didn't take the tower down. And you would think the first thing that 9/11 should have been compared to should have been the prior bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. But they never brought it up. Not one person on the media brought up the 93 bombing of the Trade Center. They all compared it to what? Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, it's very revealing. Well, I mean, that's the thing. These false flag incidents, they, are to create a mythical enemy, because one of the great things of the Cold War was that there actually was an enemy. And because there was a challenge to Western-style capitalism, capitalist elites had to make certain concessions to the working class, because they feared the working class overthrowing them and trying to form more socialistic societies. So you saw, like in European countries especially, socialized healthcare, free university education, and a host of other civil liberties and social rights were extended. But once the enemy dissipated and became a mythical enemy, because obviously they're Al-Qaeda, we know it's not a case of my enemy's enemy is my friend, but rather my enemy is my friend. The alleged enemies of the United States are actually the collaborators of the CIA and indeed of the Israeli Mossad. I mean, I would contend that the Likud party wouldn't have had a hope in hell of gaining traction in Israel if it wasn't for this notion of terrorism. We know, going back to the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism in 1979, that we had these kind of Likudniks proposing the concept of international terrorism, that we had to fear something called international terrorism. It wasn't localized terrorism contained to Palestine, but rather there was this global conspiracy of Islamists that wanted to threaten Western secular democracies. Now we know that isn't borne out by the facts. You're more likely to die from lightning or in the bathtub than from terrorism based on US statistics. And so clearly that this is a Zionist-sponsored myth to try and make us view the world through Israel's spectacles, to fear a threat from Islamic terrorism where one doesn't actually exist. Clearly they're with the secularists when it suits them, when they want to, for example, try to do regime change in Iran, which takes a more theocratic approach to its democracy. They side with the secularists, and when they are trying to do regime change in a more secular country like Syria, they side with the theocrats, the Salafis. And so, so they will side with whoever serves their interests in the pursuance of creating quasi-colonies. Obviously after World War II, there was this promise of having a post-colonial era. You think of the 19th century, and really Zionism is a kind of relic of the 19th century. I mean, everyone was doing what the Zionists are doing today in the 19th century, this idea of, Western people being God's chosen people who have a right to go and civilize the savages and make sure the natives don't get restless and so on. But what's particularly repugnant about Zionism is that it's taking that approach during an epoch when we're so integrated globally. You think of aeroplanes and the internet and the way that we're able to transcend, racial and ethnic and religious barriers and really potentially come together in a peaceful world. But Zionism, it's kind of the antithesis of globalization and of the integration of human beings, because it kind of stands for, one ethnic group basically dominating potentially a billion people of the human family.
And it causes a lot of anti-Semitism, that kind of rhetoric of chosen race of God. And this sounds ridiculous, but I'm going to throw it out there because people come out with this comment sometimes. They'll say, well, look at how huge the Arab areas are, because they think of countries as ethnicities. And they say, look at all the big, giant Arab countries, and Israel's so small. Why don't the Palestinians just leave and live in Jordan or some other Arab country? They have so much land already. That's what they like to say. And I like to give the analogy of South Africa. Let's just kick all the black people out of South Africa, because there's so many other African nations where black people live. Why don't they just go live there and make South Africa white? I mean, this is the mindset of the racists, the Zionists, where they believe a country belongs to a certain strand of DNA or whatever, and that it has to be a Jewish state. And thus, the places where there's a majority of Arabs, those are Arab states or Persian states or black or white states or whatever. They can't think of a country. No, it's a country where anybody who chooses to can live. If there's a majority, whatever, so what? I mean, that changes all the time, especially in the United States. But they don't think of it like that. The Zionist ideology is they think of themselves as the Jewish state, as a racial state. Thus, they paint the rest of the world the same way. And so they can't get it in their mind why the Palestinians don't just go live in another country.
Yes, and obviously, another thing that emerged after World War II was the concept of universal human rights. Obviously looking at what happened in World War II, where different European nation states kind of destroyed millions of people's lives. Obviously the concept of having, enshrining something in law called a human right, and trying to come up with a declaration of human rights. And this is really an early concept even today in 2012. It's something that's like a work in progress. And again, when you have concepts of chosenness and, exceptionalism, then obviously as long as your people and your group are fine and hunky-dory, you don't have to worry about the rights or the interests of the rest of humanity. And that just seems to run up against all of the potential integration that human beings could enjoy in this day and age with all the technology that has emerged. And so I think that's one of the things that's particularly off-putting about Zionism. And I think it's something that we all have to confront, especially as our own Western governments are increasingly in cahoots with these 19th century social Darwinist type thinkers. I mean, we really have to confront that reality. I mean, I think of Canada, when I think of Canada as a highly multicultural society, the part of Calgary I live in, I'm a minority as a white person, and I think it's a brilliant thing that we have people from all cultures and walks of life living in this city where I live.
Yeah, I'm certainly a minority. I'm a minority in Japan for sure, and that's fine. Yeah. No one has a problem with me here. It's perfectly fine. And that you reminded me of something else too. It's not just the racism with Zionist ideology and what have you. There's a sense of sort of worse than that, a sort of indifferent sort of hatred, where it's corporatism, where you look at, and everyone knows about these kind of things, the sweatshops in Southeast Asia or in South America, for example, where we've got little girls sewing up pants or making shoes or whatever for $1 a day, or in China, literally making toys in horrible working conditions. They put up suicide nets at the factories and things. And we know this is happening. And we see all the made in China stuff. Not everything made in China comes from a sweatshop, but there is a good portion of products that everybody in the world knows is coming from virtual slave labor. And yet, it's out of sight, out of mind. Well, I like my stuff, so I'm not going to make a bunch of noise about it. It's China's problem. What can I do about it? There's all these rationalizations for it. I don't mean just to pick on China. There's plenty of places, Indonesia, many places, and it's often not even them who are making the factories. It's foreign corporations or multinational corporations that have found a spot like a parasite to a host where they can get lots of cheap labor, basically slavery. I mean, they may pay them and they end up recycling the money back to the company store, just like the old mercantile West from the days of Lincoln and beforehand. This is happening now, but I don't think that could happen if you had it, say, a white Christian country in France or somewhere like that. If the same conditions existed there, I think there would be more action toward that than when it's in Southeast Asia or it's Latinos or something like that. I do think there is an element of racism, or at least maybe not racism, not believing your race is superior, but just not giving it a darn when it's not your culture. Some sort of just prejudice to foreigners. And it's really sad because we have all these people who are aware of these things, but you don't hear as much about that. Even with Palestinians, there's a lot of solidarity for that, but of course that's worse. People are getting murdered. However, slavery is bad enough, and there are journalists and things, and John Pillinger and people who talk about it all the time, but it's pretty much left out of the media as well. So this theft and murder and slavery goes on without an eyelash batting in U.S. media. I've never seen an in-depth story about it or anything. You'll hear about, somebody peed on a soldier's body in Afghanistan or some like distraction media like that now and then. But the systemic problems that are happening every day with the sweatshop labor and so on, nothing.
Yeah, I took a class at university on the history of the Caribbean, and it became clear to me that slavery was only abolished, like chattel slavery, because wage slavery was far more economical from the perspective of the exploiter, of the capitalist. Because when you have a slave, you have to maintain that slave in the off-season, right? If they pick cotton or, develop sugar fields from, say, February to November, or between November and February, you have to maintain that worker, and you have a vested interest in feeding it and providing sustenance to that worker. But if you have a wage laborer, once you've paid them their pay, then they aren't your responsibility anymore. And so it became clear that really capitalism was just a refinement of slavery, or a way that it was more efficient to do slavery, where the responsibility for the worker was shifted to the worker. And we see that expressed in the most grotesque ways in the United States, where we see, healthcare and everything is left to individuals who don't have enough money. I mean, even here in Canada, that it's quite clear the minimum wage will just about get you your rent, and that's it. No food, no cell phone, anything on top if you have a minimum wage job now. nearly 1 million people in Canada are turning to food banks now, have to go to charity to get food. And this is in the country where I live. We have the third largest oil reserves in the world and the second largest uranium reserves in the world. And yet, we're not doing what Venezuela does. In Venezuela, the oil wealth goes to a state-owned oil company, which then uses that money to subsidize food costs with state-owned supermarkets and fund schools and hospitals and universities. I gather Hugo Chavez has built dozens of universities in Venezuela with the oil money. In our case, we allow these unelected, unaccountable plutocrats to despoil the resources that exist under our feet. And
this will happen in
the shareholders,
capitalists, communists, whatever, and democracies. It's all a blur. We live under a plutocracy. Some people say oligarchs, but that's technically incorrect because it's not all families. But it is ruled by money, and our democratic system is over and has been over for a long time. The moment people realized they could vote themselves money, it was over. And we have these massive corporations that have bought and paid for our Congress or your Parliament or whoever, and it does not function as representatives of the people. They represent special interests. That is what can pay for campaigns, and if you want to be on TV, you have to toe the line. And if you aren't on TV, you are not going to get elected. You could have the best message in the world. You could have the population agreeing with you on the issues. 90% of the people agreeing with you on the issues, like, say, abolishing the TSA in the United States. No one likes the TSA. Ron Paul put a bill forward to get rid of it. They refused to vote on it. And this has massive popular support, but it doesn't matter because they don't represent the people. And those who are getting elected, it's this kind of lowest common denominator phenomenon where people are always picking between the lesser of two evils instead of picking for the person they want. Because usually they don't want anybody because they never heard of anyone that actually speaks to their issues. Because if you do that, you can't be in the debates, you can't be on TV. The only way you're going to be known at all would probably be on the internet.
Yeah, so coming back to the Gaza subject, which is the topic du jour, obviously I was watching the Press TV newsreel earlier, and at the beginning of the newsreel, the death count was 110, and by the end of the newsreel, the death count was 114 Palestinians who had been slain by the Zionist regime. So how's this going to end, Ryan? Where are we going with this? Obviously, Israel might be escalating to a ground invasion. As I say, my hypothesis is that, or my thesis is that, Israel's intention in the long run is to make life in Gaza so unbearable as to make it incumbent on the Palestinians to flee that polity, that part of the world, that Israel wants to establish its greater Israel, not in an overt apartheid state, because an apartheid state is where you actually keep the indigenous people there and exploit their labor, but actually a final ethnic cleansing, a final solution to the Palestine question, so the Nile and Euphrates Greater Israel state can be erected and the Palestinians won't be there anymore. It will be a completely Judaized state. Is that what's
going to happen?
I think they're aiming a little bit of both. They're aiming at apartheid. They're forcing anybody with any wealth to leave, and they have no right of return. And the people who are stuck there are stuck there. But Israel enjoys that virtual slave labor as well. And when the Gazans have to commute and work on, the Israeli-controlled roads, checkpoints, and everything into Israel to work, they're not getting paid very much money. And Israel enjoys that slave labor. And to wipe them all out, even the international community isn't going to stand for that much if they went that quick, that fast. But what they do is they make life such hell, and they control the food, they have an embargo on everything. They bomb people, they terrorize them, to where if you have enough money to leave, you're going to. And they're losing their capital, they're losing their wealth, and what you're left with are the poorest of the poor, and mostly children, who are stuck there, who will be living under apartheid. And the other reason to push people to leave and to outright murder whole generations was Israel fears the growing demographic of Palestinians. They want Jews to be the majority. Were a two-state solution or one-state solution to ever come down the line, they are afraid that they would be marginalized and become a minority within their own homeland. That, of course, it's such a crime to just live with other people. They don't want to do.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's the thing. What gives them the right to want to not be demographically destroyed? I mean, the fact is these mostly Euro-American Jews moved to the Middle East and established this Zionist entity in the middle of the Arab and Muslim world. I mean, to complain that you have a demographic threat seems a bit rich when...
And it really doesn't matter. I mean, so what? You're a minority, so what? I mean, Jews are a minority in the U.S. and Canada and many other places where lots of people are minorities in wherever they live. That is far better than just wiping out everyone that doesn't look like you or believe in the same God as you. I mean, that's really, really crazy. If they were to become a minority, they still have the exact same number of people they had yesterday. You know, the culture will be there as much as it ever was. But just because there's some other group out there that has more numbers than you do, doesn't erase you or anything like that. I mean, talk to any atheist. They're always going to be a minority. It doesn't affect them. It's not going to make them religious or anything. They're not going to be bred out or anything like that. I mean, it's just an insane way of thinking. Oh, we're going to be the minority. So that's because there are more of the other kind of people and they're having more babies. I mean, you can't just murder them. But this is the fear. They're afraid that if they ever did get equal rights, that it would become a kind of Palestinian majority, Palestinian government, and that they would implement their own ideology. And what would be wrong with that? Well, because that ideology does not include the chosen race of God exclusively for a certain set of people, and they want these rules, and they want Israel to be Jewish. And they really fear that their culture would be wiped out. The problem is they're in a culture of mass murder, theft, and apartheid, and that shouldn't last. The apartheid part shouldn't, the murder shouldn't, the theft shouldn't. If you want to maintain your religion and you want to maintain historical and cultural non-violent aspects of your history, then do it. But you don't have to wipe out everyone around you to do that. Look at any minority in the United States, Canada, or anywhere in the world. You're not going to be wiped off the map.
But when the Afrikaners were doing a similar thing in South Africa, there was international outrage and condemnation. But when it comes to Israel, obviously they have the lobby, they have their sort of network of Zionists around the world that prevent politicians and media personalities from voicing overt criticism of Israel's actions. And so Israel obviously is afforded impunity when it engages in these atrocities. I mean, 114 people killed. I mean, I think that's comparable to like the Soweto massacre that is... a page in the history books when secret police in South Africa, gunned down a lot of children and youth in
it's like the Oklahoma City bombing or something like that. But they killed over 1,000 in Cass-Led in 2008, over 1,000 civilians.
Yes. So Israel, clearly Israel's way worse, for example, than the Afrikaners. And yet,
but even in South Africa, not everyone was against it in the beginning. I mean, it was 1990 before we could really boycott and cause the apartheid to fail on paper, and it took many more years to really change things, and there's still problems. And
Mandela was a terrorist. Mandela was called a terrorist, right?
Well, right. But that was recent, and that was pre-internet as well, for the most part. But, through the 80s, there wasn't a lot of opposition. I mean, there was some, but it's such a common sense issue. You would think, oh, what, racial apartheid? I mean, now that's insane. But it went on for a long time. It was only very recently that people were grown up enough to admit how wrong that was, and the world come down on it. But Israel has protected itself from that scenario happening there because they have the biggest bully around by the short hairs. They run U.S. media, and that's the only friend they need.
Yes, and so... one thing I mentioned earlier, I recently just watched George Galloway's analysis of what's going on, and he was saying how, when the IRA were basically terrorizing the people of Britain, I mean, we know there was complicity with MI5 and so on, but, like when my mother went to university in the 70s, there was no trash cans, there was even a curfew, I think, because the government wanted to protect people, at least ostensibly, from the IRA terrorists. But Britain never went to Northern Ireland and then dropped bombs on IRA strongholds or Catholic strongholds in the north of Ireland. And there would have been international outrage even from the United States and other countries had they done so.
It would have just caused everyone that lived there to join the IRA as well.
Yeah, so you could argue, rockets flinging into, you can call it what you want, resistance or targeting civilians, but it happens. There are rockets flying into Israel. But the idea that you solve that when you're the fourth largest military in the world...
But let's be clear, Hamas is also scum. Hamas is scum. Just because they don't have the toys that are the equivalent of the Israelis doesn't mean they're any more or less moral. they're not just defending Palestine. Hamas has a similar ideology. They were created by Israel to replace the PLO. And so it's just sort of the boogeyman they wanted.
But
they propped them up and put them in charge. They're nuts. I mean, I don't support Hamas.
Yes, I think someone with your values and my values probably wouldn't have voted for Hamas. But is it not also true that it's hard to distinguish between who's Hamas and who's a Gazan,
Well, of course. You can't just randomly kill whoever, of course. But, I mean, if they had intelligence, they could remove these people, but it wouldn't be an issue if they didn't have an ongoing military occupation and blockade on Gaza to begin with. There's no way Hamas would ever have been elected. This was an act of desperation because nothing had worked after decades and decades, so they finally pushed for Hamas because no one else was doing anything or was able to do anything.
Well, Al-Fatah has been so corrupted by Israel have cultivated compradors within Fatah, which made the Palestinians have no choice but to try and vote for a different party with the hope that they might actually do something. And I mean, this is one of the issues we have to get over as Westerners, that, in the Middle East, people are more religious. They didn't go through the historic sort of enlightenment, what we call the kind of secular enlightenment, the embracement of, scientific rationality and, being skeptical of a notion of there being a God and so on. And that's not to say that people in the Middle East don't embrace science. I mean, obviously, we see with Iran, it's highly innovative with its science and so on. But people in the Middle East are theocratic, and they are more likely to vote for a theocratic party like Hamas. And although that might run up against our own values as Westerners, we can't judge people on that basis alone. Obviously, that's their choice. It's not up to you or I to choose the leadership of the people of Gaza. And in some ways, it's fathomable why they would turn to Hamas when Al-Fatah had been so corrupted and their leadership had been cultivated as Malinches, as compradors, people who will serve the interests of the imperial authority, the colonial authority of Israel. And so it's clear to me that the people of Gaza opted for Hamas because they were an alternative.
Right. I understand why it is. I'm just putting my 2 cents out there since I don't live there. And I have the advantage of looking at it like that. But I don't think science replaced religiosity. I think commercialism became the new religion. That's more of the core part of culture. I mean, I always joke, if you want to know about a culture like in a nutshell, just look at the billboards. If you want to go to Iran, you'll see a lot of quotes from the Quran and religious things. But you go to the U.S. or New York, it looks like you're inside a computer full of pop-ups. Every available surface is an advertisement to buy shiny things. It's not about science or anything like that. It's about
architects and engineers time.
Right. Yeah. Unless it's. I mean, of course, we have science for everything, but you look at it. We commercialism is the new faith. Come look at Black Friday here in a couple of days, and you'll see how gun-ho people are to buy stuff. I call them the Beanie Baby heads. That was the phenomenon in the U.S. with the stuffed animal everybody needed to have. But I think that is more on the minds of the basic, run-of-the-mill average Joe than scientific thought. I mean, we did have a revolution in scientific thought in some circles. But I think the majority of the culture is much more caught up in celebrity issues and shopping and things like that. I think that's more the new faith. And they may be religious as well, but not to the same degree. I mean, they kind of say, oh, my parents are whatever, and so am I. But they don't really think about it every day. They don't pray every day. They don't whatever. I mean, they just sort of tacitly have a religion. But the real all-consuming thought in their mind is buying stuff.
Yeah,
and that's what people are scared of, not the science or anything. They're scared of being totally commercialized.
Yes. Well, I mean, I see what you mean. I mean, the fact of the matter is that it's clear that a lot of religious people have more of a moral compass than is found among the populations of capitalist, individualistic societies such as the United States. I mean, I often go to protests and half the people or more are religious, and that's just a reality people who are more secular like myself have to confront. That yes, this consumerism, this fetishism of the commodity has led us into this kind of amoral quagmire where people don't ask themselves what's right and wrong. They merely ask themselves what's best for me and how can I enrich myself.
I agree with those examples, but yet you take a place like Japan, lowest crime rate in the world, longest life expectancy, and there's really no theology at all. there's a little bit of Buddhism, but it's nothing more than rituals for funerals and things. It's basically an atheist country, and it has the least amount of crime, the least amount of problems. They don't have these conflicts, and yet when they did have an emperor and a lot of religiosity, they were doing the insane things. So I don't think it's religion or not that makes people moral. It's something else within the culture that makes the religion moral or not, or makes the lack of religion moral or not. That predicates whether or not the religion or lack of it is more like a car, not the driver. And the fear of God or Allah, whatever, is not what makes somebody behave. Their parents raising them the right way is what makes them behave. And when they see thuggery and stuff glorified on television constantly, and they see serial killers who were famous, and lots of stuff from television and propaganda and other aspects in the media, and the violence of our own government in the United States, for example, all the warfare, and children are just brought up with nothing but fighting constantly, and everything is glorified. Your history class is basically the history of wars, nothing else, not invention or any other aspect of history. It's just who's fighting who and who won and who painted what on the map. It's war, 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 and poverty is the other issue. Poverty causes crime. Whether there's religion or not, if people are poor enough, they're going to steal, they're going to commit crimes, they're going to be violent. I think that's more the issue than whether they believe in invisible man or not.
Yes. Yes, I studied Japanese at university, and I told you I've traveled to Japan, and I think that one thing with Japan is that there's a humility there because they kind of made their mistakes, and so there's this kind of self-analytical position taken by many people in Japanese society that doesn't exist in other societies. I mean, one thing I'm worried about with a country like Canada is it's never been bombed. It's never really done. It's been a junior partner in imperialism, but it's never been very interventionist in the world. It's kind of gone along with what its imperial masters have told it to do. But Canada, it's not really made its mistakes yet. And so when I see Canada going down this Zionist path of deciding the fate of the Syrian people, who can govern Syria, siding with armed gangs in Syria. I worry for a country like Canada, for example, that hasn't made its mistakes. And I look at a country like Japan or Germany. I heard Dr. Norman Finkelstein, he was quoting apparently, one of the 4 most hated countries on the planet, according to the Pew statistics, which is a reliable, polling place, is Israel. But apparently the 2 most popular were Germany and Japan. And that tells you a lot, because if you lived in the 1930s or 40s, obviously Germany, my SD card just changed. So I just made that point again because my SD card just changed. So, so obviously, if you're living in Germany, if you were living in the 1930s or 1940s in Europe, that Japan and Germany would have been highly unpopular. But today they're the most popular countries. And so one reason I think Japan is quite a reasonable society is because it's made its mistakes already, and it's lived through upheavals, and it's had its problems. Whereas I think that a lot of societies, even the United States, is still a newcomer if you think about it. I think it was Deng Xiaoping was asked about the French Revolution, the leader of China, previous leader of China, and he said it's too early to say. And I think a country like the United States, 1776 wasn't that long ago. And Canada too, it really only became a country in the 1860s, officially, and it only got a constitution in 1980. And so, when we think of these countries, they are still quite useful. Same with Israel too. They are yet to make their mistakes, and that's what's troubling as we see them go off the precipice into, a kind of fascistic society. I think it's really something we have to confront, and doing YouTubes and having discussions, transcending the boundaries, the best kind of globalization, because clearly the kind of wage slavery that we discussed earlier on is the worst form of globalization, where transnational corporations can kind of blackmail different countries to force their workers to accept a lower wage, to force the people to accept a lower corporate tax, so none of the wealth that's enjoyed that's usurped by the corporation is distributed back to the people. So I think one of the worst aspects of globalization is the ability for corporations often to have a greater GDP, a greater economy than some nation states. And as a result, they can blackmail different societies to have their workers be employed in an exploitative relationship.
It is pretty baffling how we judge the economy by points on the Dow Jones. Like, how well are the richest people in the world doing? Did they get richer today or not? And they judge the entire economy with, oh, the stock market went up or the stock market went down. But a lot of people who aren't speculating at all, they don't own any stocks and have nothing to do with it. You ought to be looking at unemployment rates or quality of life and quality of living. Are people happy or not? What's the standard wage? What's the mean, income? No, that's not what we judge it on. We judge it on how well are the richest people in the world doing today. Let's look at the Dow. And that's what they freak out about, is how far the stock market dropped or not. And not how many people have a job. How many people have enough to pay more than just their mortgage and to eat. They don't look at that. They don't judge it by the poorest or the middle class. They're judged by how rich are the richest and are we making them richer today. And I've always thought, that's always blown my mind, how they look at the stock market and freak out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, when I listen to the financial news, I often ask myself, well, how much relevance does this have to the everyday life of ordinary people? And
does it affect you? Like you? Did the Dow drop so it doesn't matter to you?
Yeah, I mean, if the news gave us, say, like trade union news, that would be way more relevant to the majority of people. Like, what's the leadership of the trade union saying? Because many people, members of the working class, belong to trade unions. So if you give trade union news or, like you say, unemployment figures, that would be far more relevant, far more germane to the everyday life of ordinary working class people. But yeah, these financial statistics, they're kind of a way of making us buy into this, unjust system that we live in.
It's like, who are they talking to on CNBC? They're talking about invest in this or buy this and diversify and make sure you own some oil, some gold, some this or that. Who are they talking to? Who are those customers? Because I don't know any of those people that can afford to buy all those stocks and things like they're recommending. And this is daily. Like, let's play this gambling game every day. And they get up there and it's like 5 or 6 people all yelling at the top of their lungs and nobody listening to each other, ranting about stocks and stuff. Most of it's hype. Do people watch that just for entertainment? I mean, I know there are investors out there, of course. But does that really need such a prime slot on television and everything that they wipe that all out on the so-called business news on CNBC with Kramer and the rest of the goofballs? I mean, who are these people? These aren't. They don't live in the real world. They don't know what it's like to have a regular salary or wage job. The common people in the culture. They have no clue. They talk about things like, oh, you ought to just buy this or whatever. People can't do that. They don't have the money to play with like that.
Yeah, I think a basic thing that one has to accept is that trickle-down economic theory doesn't actually work in practice, as John Kenneth Galbraith, the famous economist John Kenneth Galbraith said, it's like giving a donkey more oats and hoping something else will come out the other end. And so, I mean, I think the point of the matter is that once, we talk about this celebration of, the financial statistics in the media and so on, and that's a way of trying to persuade us that we have a vested interest, basically, in the elite becoming more profitable, because if they become more profitable, they will create more jobs and they will pay us more money, perhaps give us bonuses.
What's the incentive to pass rather than just pocket? Why do they have to pass it on to anyone else? They don't. They just get more and more bonuses and get richer and richer and buy up more stuff. I mean, it's not like, oh, you made them wealthier, they're going to spend that on higher wages and things. That's not the case. It technically could be, but why would they do that when they could pocket the profits?
Exactly. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I think that accepting trickle-down economic theory doesn't actually work. It's a completely idealistic notion that doesn't bear the facts. Don't bear it out. Don't actually. It's not like there is a increased creation of jobs or increase in salaries. In fact, the opposite is true.
For corporations, I mean, once you're corporatized, you're beholden to shareholders. That's what you're trying to make yourself go up a quarter point or whatever. When it's a small business or something and you give them a tax break so that they could, let's say it's a motel or something, build another room or hire another maid, or, that would create jobs. But when you're talking about people who don't even manufacture things, it's not even like that. It's just like, how can we cut costs in some way so that our share goes up, so that we have more shareholders and stuff? And it's a bunch of people speculating. It's become this big gambling game of computers bouncing numbers back and forth. And the actual products and stuff are so distant from that. It has very little to do with it. For a large company like, let's say, Coca-Cola or something like that, how many Cokes you actually sold that day do not affect the price as much as how many stocks were bought and sold that day. And so they talk more about buying and selling stocks and hyping you need to buy this or not for this reason than they do on actually manufacturing the product, which, at least has some benefit to somebody. You get a drink out of it, you get jobs out of it, you get something. And you don't have to like Coke. I'm just using an example.
Yeah.
But for this most of the things, they're not making anything. Especially a lot of these financial institutions. What are they doing? Conning people out of money to buy, things with false ratings from credit agencies who they bribed, and all the shenanigans they did, and they got bailed out with more money we borrowed from the Fed. It's unreal. Speculating shit in. I have an idea. Why don't you work for a living? Why don't you actually produce something, like have labor and you get paid for that, rather than making money from having money? That's what I think is ridiculous. I'd like to get rid of speculation altogether, which sounds extreme. I'm fine with real investments where you actually loan money to somebody to help, build something to get a return later once they have their business, you can get a loan from a bank, you can get a loan from your family or whatever. You can get investors like that, but it's gotten out of control with these IPOs, is gathering lots of money from other people who have borrowed money from people who have borrowed money, and it's just this loan 4 to pay loan 3 to pay loan 2. It's this giant scheme. And most of our money is caught up in speculation, not in actual work, actual manufacturing, actual goods and services.
Making things. I mean, this usurious society that we've created, or the elite have created, has been disastrous for the majority of human beings. When I think of a country like Britain, where I emerged from before I came to Canada, I grew up in England. We used to be the manufacturing center of the world. We created things, we created ships and products of all kinds. But now Britain is a good example. The city of London, it's just financiers moving money around on computer screens, and that's basically the center of our economy, trying to attract capitalists into our small island. It's all based on thin air. Yeah, sure. That would be good to do it. To do this again. I'm feeling a bit tired because it's now 3:19 a.m. where I am. But I think that was really fruitful for us to discuss this, to have it on record that. Yeah. Well, I think. Yeah. Well, just to get it on the record that we don't support the assault on the people of Gaza right now, that we support Palestinian self-determination. Saying these things is important, because there's an attempt to destroy Palestinian society. The blockade in and of itself is clearly an attempt to starve, to destroy the Palestinian people, and these ongoing assaults are the kind of thing that we need to stand up against and do our best to stand in solidarity with the poor people of Palestine. We're all victims of international Zionism to some extent, but the Palestinians are clearly on the front lines, experiencing that misanthropy, experiencing that exceptionalism, the brunt of it that they're running into. Well, exactly. That is true. Oh, exactly. You're right. You're totally right about that. And the Afrikaners were exactly the same. They thought they were like Calvinists, they thought they were the elect, like God-chosen people. But anyway, let's wrap this up. And I'm looking forward to posting this. And thanks, Ryan Dawson. Say konnichiwa, genki desu ka to your people there. And I wish I was there in Japan with you. Maybe I will be one day. And